Act 1. The Strangest Battle. Imagine a battle where American soldiers and German soldiers fight side by side, where a Sherman tank and a group of Wehrmacht infantry defend a medieval castle. Not against each other, together, against the SS. This is not a screenplay. It is not an alternate history. It happened. On May 5th, 1945, at a castle in the Austrian Alps called Schloss Itter. And it was the only time during the entire Second World War that Americans and Germans fought as allies. The war in Europe was essentially over. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The German army was surrendering en masse. But in the Tyrol Mountains, a fanatical SS division was still fighting. And they had one objective: eliminate a group of high-value French prisoners being held at Castle Itter before the Allies could get to them. These were not ordinary prisoners. They included 2 former Prime Ministers of France, 2 former Commanders-in-Chief of the French Army, and other politicians and generals who had been captured early in the war. They were witnesses to Nazi crimes, and the SS wanted them dead. What happened next defied every rule of war. An American tank captain, a German Wehrmacht major, and a handful of Allied prisoners formed an improvised defensive force. When the SS attacked, they fought back, together. The battle lasted a day. By the time it was over, one of the German officers lay dead, having given his life to save the French prisoners he had once guarded. To understand how this impossible alliance came to be, we need to go back to the castle itself, back to the prisoners who were trapped inside it, and back to a German officer who decided that following his conscience was more important than following orders. Act 2. The Prisoners in the Castle. Castle Itter sits on a hilltop in the Austrian Tyrol, overlooking the Breakout Valley. It's a small, sturdy medieval fortress, not a grand palace. In 1943, the SS took it over and turned it into a special prison, a subsidiary of the Dachau concentration camp. But the prisoners here were not ordinary inmates. They were VIPs, Ehrenhäftlinge, honor prisoners. People the Nazis wanted to keep alive as bargaining chips. Who were they? The list reads like a who's who of pre-war France. Édouard Daladier, Prime Minister of France, who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938. Paul Reynaud, the Prime Minister who had led France during the German invasion in 1940. General Maurice Gamelin, the Commander-in-Chief of the French Army. General Maxime Weygel, his successor. There was also Jean Barotre, one of the greatest tennis players in the world, a former French sports minister who had been arrested for resisting the Vichy regime, and Marie-Agnès Caillou, the sister of General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. Let me tell you a little more about these people, because they were not just names on a list. They were men and women with extraordinary lives, trapped in an impossible situation. Édouard Daladier. He was the Prime Minister of France who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938. That piece of paper was supposed to guarantee peace for our time. Daladier knew it was a lie. He later wrote that when he flew back to France after Munich, he expected to be booed by the crowd for betraying Czechoslovakia. Instead, he was cheered. He turned to an aide and muttered, "The fools." 6 years later, sitting in a damp castle cell in Austria, he must have thought about that moment 1,000 times. The cheering crowd, the lie he had signed, the war that came anyway. And now, here he was, an old man, waiting to die at the hands of the same regime he had tried to appease. There is something almost unbearably tragic about Daladier's story. He was not a bad man, he was a weak man, and history had judged him harshly. In the castle, he had a chance to redeem himself, not with words, but with a rifle in his hands. Paul Reynaud, If Daladier was the appeaser, Reynaud was the fighter. He became Prime Minister in March 1940, just as the German tanks were rolling into France. He wanted to fight on. He begged his cabinet to continue the war from North Africa, but the defeatists, led by Marshal Pétain, overruled him. Reynaud resigned. The Vichy government arrested him. Think about that. He was imprisoned not by the Germans, but by his own countrymen. He spent the rest of the war being shuttled between prisons, a hostage of the collaborationist regime he had tried to stop. At Castle Itter, Reynaud was the most defiant of the prisoners. He refused to show fear. He kept a diary in tiny handwriting, hidden from the guards. In it, he wrote, "If I am to die, I want the world to know that I died standing, not kneeling." Jean Barotra, the bounding Basque, four-time winner of the Davis Cup, one of the greatest tennis players who ever lived. Before the war, Barotra was a national hero in France. He was also the Minister of Sport in the Vichy government, a position he took hoping to protect French athletes and institutions. But he quickly became disillusioned with the Nazi collaboration. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 for trying to help prisoners escape. That's how he ended up at Castle Itter. Barotra was 47 years old, but he was still in extraordinary physical shape. He exercised in his cell every day. He had no idea that his athleticism would soon save everyone in the castle. Marie-Agnès Caillou. She was the older sister of Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. She had done nothing wrong. Her only crime was her last name. The Gestapo arrested her in 1940, hoping to use her as leverage against de Gaulle. It didn't work. De Gaulle never negotiated with the Nazis, but his sister suffered for it. Years in prison camps, uncertainty, terror. At Castle Itter, she was the quiet center of the group. The men, politicians and generals, might bicker and argue, but everyone respected her. She represented something they were all fighting for: ordinary people caught in the gears of history. These prisoners had been moved from camp to camp as the war progressed. They had witnessed the collapse of their country, the humiliation of occupation, and the daily cruelty of their captors. By April 1945, they could hear the Allied guns approaching from the west, and they knew that their time was running out. The SS was not going to let them fall into Allied hands alive. They were witnesses, and witnesses in the final days of the Third Reich were meant to be silenced. The commander of the castle's SS guards was a man named Sebastian Wimmer. He was a loyal Nazi, but he was not stupid. He could see that the war was lost. As the Allied armies approached, Wimmer faced a choice: carry out the expected mass execution of his prisoners, or abandon his post and flee. On May 4th, he made his decision. He and his guards simply left. The prisoners were now free, but unarmed and stuck on a hilltop in the middle of a war zone, with an SS division just down the road. Act 3. The Last Fanatics. The SS division in question was the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen. These were die-hard fanatics. Even after Hitler's suicide, even after the surrender of most German forces, they were still fighting. They were roaming the Tyrol, looking for deserters to hang and looking for prisoners to execute. And they knew about Castle Itter. Why did the SS care so much about a bunch of aging French politicians? Because these prisoners were living proof of the Nazi regime's crimes. They had been present at the great humiliations of the 1930s and 1940s. They knew about the secret protocols. They knew about the concentration camps. The SS leadership wanted every trace of that evidence erased. Orders had been given. No VIP prisoner was to fall into Allied hands alive. The prisoners at Itter knew this. They had heard the rumors. They had seen the SS guards whispering before they fled. Some of them prepared for death. Daladier, the former prime minister, reportedly told his fellow prisoners, "If we are to die, let us die with dignity." But they were not going to die, because help was on its way, from two completely unexpected directions. One was a column of American tanks rolling into the valley. The other was a German officer who had decided that he would rather save his enemies than serve his masters. That officer's name was Joseph Gangl, and his story is at the heart of this battle. Let me tell you about Joseph Gangl, because without him, there is no story. Gangl was born in 1910 in Bavaria. His family was not wealthy. His father was a railway worker. As a young man, Gangl joined the Reichswehr, the German army, because it offered a steady career. He was not political. He was a professional soldier. He believed in duty, in honor, in protecting his country. But he did not believe in the Nazis. As the 1930s went on, Gangl watched with growing disgust as the army was purged of its best officers and turned into a tool of Hitler's ambition. By the time the war started, he was a senior lieutenant. He fought on the Eastern Front, where he was wounded. He fought in France. He did his duty, but his heart was never in it. The turning point came in early 1945. Gangl was stationed in the Tyrol, where he witnessed something that shattered him. An SS unit had caught a group of teenage Austrian boys who had deserted. They hanged them from lampposts in the town square. Just children. Their bodies were left there for days as a warning. Gangl walked past them every morning. He couldn't stop thinking about their faces. He later wrote in his diary, "I can no longer serve this regime. I must serve the people instead." He made contact with the Austrian resistance. He began passing information. He hid deserters. He assembled a small group of soldiers, Wehrmacht men who felt the same way, and even a few SS defectors, to protect local villages from the marauding SS death squads. He knew the risk. If he was caught, he would be shot on the spot. His wife and two young daughters would be punished. But he had reached a point where not acting was more unbearable than the danger. In the last week of his life, Joseph Gangl wrote a letter to his wife. It was short and simple. He told her he loved her. He told her he was doing what he knew to be right. He asked her to forgive him if he did not come home. She received that letter after he was already dead. Act 4. An Unlocks Alliance. Joseph Gangl was a career soldier. He had fought in the German army since before the war. He was not a Nazi. He was a professional officer who had grown increasingly disgusted with the regime he served. In the final months of the war, Gangl had been assigned to a rearguard unit in the Tyrol. But instead of fighting the Allies, he had made contact with the Austrian resistance. His small unit, a handful of Wehrmacht soldiers and a few defectors from the SS, had become a kind of local militia, protecting Austrian civilians from the rampaging SS death squads. When Gangl heard about the prisoners at Castle Itter, he knew what was coming. The SS would attack. They would kill everyone, and he decided that he could not let that happen. But his little band of irregulars was no match for a full SS Panzergrenadier Division. He needed help. And that help arrived on May 4th in the form of an American reconnaissance unit. The Americans were from the 12th Armored Division, part of the US 7th Army. Their lead element was a column of Sherman tanks and armored cars commanded by Captain John C. "Jack" Lee, Jr. Lee was a young, bold officer. He had been pushing his column deep behind what remained of the German lines. When he rolled into the town of Vergel, he met Gangl. Under a white flag, Gangl explained the situation. There were French V-1Ps trapped in a castle up the road. The SS was going to massacre them. He, Gangl, was willing to help the Americans save them. This was an insane proposal. Americans and Germans had been killing each other for 4 years, and now a German officer, still in full uniform, was asking to join forces? Lee had every reason to refuse. He could have dismissed Gangle as a trickster or a traitor, but something in Gangle's face made him believe. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the honest fear in the man's eyes. Lee agreed. The plan was simple and suicidal. Lee would take a handful of his men and one Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, up the narrow, winding road to Castle Itter. Gangle and about a dozen of his German soldiers would go with them. They would secure the castle, evacuate the prisoners, and get out before the SS could react. That was the plan. The plan did not survive contact with reality. Act 5. The calm before the storm. The small convoy reached Castle Itter without incident. They rolled through the gates, past the empty guard posts. The French prisoners, who had been expecting death, suddenly found themselves being greeted by a young American captain and a group of German soldiers with their weapons pointed at the floor. It was surreal. Deladier later described it as a scene from a dream, a beautiful, impossible dream. The prisoners were overjoyed, but they were also trained soldiers and politicians. They understood that the danger was far from over. Lee set up a defensive perimeter around the castle. He placed Besotten Jenny at the main gate, commanding the approach road. Gangle's Germans took up positions alongside the Americans. And then, something extraordinary happened. Several of the French prisoners asked for weapons. Generals Gamelin and Weygand, old men who had not fired a shot in anger for years, picked up rifles. The Tennistar Jean Barotra, who was in his late 40s, volunteered to be a runner. These prisoners, who had been locked away for years, were now part of the defensive force. Lee, Gangle, and their mixed squad of Americans and Germans, now reinforced by a crew of elderly French V-1Ps, prepared to face the SS. They did not have to wait long. On the morning of May 5th, the SS attacked. A column of trucks and armored vehicles from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division came up the road. The fanatics had arrived, and they wanted blood. Act 6. The SS attack. 10 a.m. The 1st SS reconnaissance unit appeared on the road below the castle. They were wary. They knew something was not right. The usual SS guards were gone, and the castle gates were closed. A small group of SS soldiers crept up through the woods, testing the defenses. Gangle spotted them first. He squeezed off a single shot from his rifle, and one of the SS men crumpled. The battle had begun. 10:30 a.m. The SS regrouped and attacked in force. About 150 men from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division launched a coordinated assault. They moved up through the trees, firing machine guns and lobbing grenades. The defenders, Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen alike, returned fire from behind sandbags and stone walls. The Sherman tank Besotten Jenny was the backbone of the defense. Its 76mm gun boomed every few seconds, sending high-explosive shells into the SS positions. But the tank was also the biggest target. 11 a.m. An SS soldier, armed with a Panzerschreck, the German bazooka, crawled to within 50 meters of the Sherman. The defenders on the walls saw him and screamed warnings, but it was too late. The rocket streaked across the courtyard and hit Besotten Jenny in the side. The explosion was deafening. The tank was knocked out. Its crew scrambled out of the hatches, some of them bleeding from shrapnel wounds. They grabbed rifles and joined the infantry. 11:30 a.m. The loss of the tank was devastating. The defenders were now outgunned and outnumbered. The SS sensed victory and pressed forward. They got within grenade range of the castle walls. Shrapnel tore through the courtyard. One of the French prisoners, General Gamelin, was hit in the leg. He fell, bleeding heavily. Joseph Gangl, without a moment's hesitation, ran into the open to drag him to cover. As he did, a sniper's bullet struck him in the head. Gangl was dead before he hit the ground. The man who had brought this unlikely alliance together had given his life for it. 12 p.m. The defenders were running out of ammunition. Captain Lee went from position to position, counting bullets. Some men had 5 rounds left, some had 3. Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister, looked at his rifle and thought about what would happen when the ammo ran out. He later wrote, "I decided I would save 1 bullet for myself." 12:30 p.m. It was at this moment, the darkest moment of the battle, that Jean Barotra made his proposal. He would go for help. It was a suicidal idea. The castle was surrounded. The only way out was over the wall and through the woods, where SS patrols were everywhere. But Barotra was a world-class athlete. He was fast, he was agile, and he was willing to die trying. Lee reluctantly agreed. Barotra shook hands with his fellow prisoners, climbed onto a pile of rubble, and vaulted over the castle wall. He landed hard, picked himself up, and started running. SS bullets cracked past him. He zigzagged through the trees, his tennis-trained reflexes keeping him alive. Within minutes, he had vanished into the forest. Act 7. The Tank Duel and the Breakout. Barotra's mad dash is one of the most astonishing acts of individual courage in the entire war. He was 47 years old. He had spent years in a prison camp. He was not a trained soldier, but he was an athlete, and he was fast. He vaulted over the castle wall, landed in the brush, and ran. SS bullets cracked past him. He dodged through the trees, scrambled down a rocky slope, and disappeared into the valley. He found an American column, a relief force from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, and frantically explained the situation. The Americans had already been alerted by radio messages from the castle, but Barotra's eyewitness account gave them the urgency they needed. The relief force raced toward the castle, with Barotra riding on the hood of a jeep, directing them up the mountain. Back at the castle, things were desperate. The defenders were down to their last bullets. The SS were massing for the final push. Captain Lee, now in command of a force that included French former prime ministers and German deserters, prepared for a last stand. And then, through the trees, they heard the sound of engines. The relief column had arrived. American tanks and infantry swept up the road and crashed into the SS positions from behind. The fanatics, who had been expecting to slaughter a few dozen defenders, suddenly found themselves trapped between the castle's defenders and a fresh American battalion. The SS broke. They fled into the woods. The battle was over. The defenders stumbled out of the castle, exhausted, covered in dirt and blood. French politicians shook hands with American tankers and German soldiers. Captain Lee and his men were hailed as heroes. But the man who had made the whole thing possible, Joseph Gangl, lay dead in the courtyard. When the guns fell silent, a strange stillness settled over Castle Itter. The courtyard was littered with shell casings, broken glass, and pools of blood. The wreck of Besotten Jenny sat silently by the gate, smoke still curling from its engine. The bodies of dead SS soldiers lay in the woods around the castle. Inside the walls, the living stared at each other in disbelief. They had survived. One of the first things they did was honor Joseph Gangl. His body was carried into the castle chapel and laid out with dignity. The American soldiers, men who had been trained to hate the German uniform, stood at attention and saluted. The French prisoners, some of them weeping openly, formed a guard of honor. Gangl had been their captor. Then he had been their protector. Now he was their hero. Captain Lee later wrote in his report, "Without Major Gangl, this mission would have failed. He was the bravest man I ever met." The French V-1Ps were loaded onto trucks and driven down the mountain. As they passed through the valley, they saw the evidence of the collapsing Third Reich everywhere. Abandoned tanks, columns of German prisoners, burned-out villages. But they also saw green fields and mountains and a sky that was not filled with smoke. They were free. Daladier, the man who had signed Munich, looked back at the castle and said nothing, but tears ran down his face. Jean Barotra, the tennis star who had run through the bullets, was asked by a reporter what it felt like. He smiled, the same smile he had flashed at Wimbledon a dozen times, and said, "It was the best match I ever played, and I won." Act 8. The Aftermath. In the immediate aftermath, the French V-1Ps were evacuated and eventually returned to France. Some of them, like Daladier and Reynaud, resumed their political careers. Others faded into obscurity. Jean Barotra, the tennis player who had run through enemy fire, was awarded medals for his bravery. He remained an active tennis coach well into his 90s. Captain Jack Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Castle Itter. He went home, raised a family, and rarely spoke about the battle. When he died in 1973, his obituary did not even mention the strangest battle of World War II. And what about Joseph Gangl? He was buried in the local cemetery in Vergel, the town he had helped protect. After the war, the Austrian government named a street after him, Joseph Gangl Strasse. It is a quiet road in a small town, easily overlooked. But it is there. A reminder that even in the darkest times, some people choose to do the right thing, no matter the cost. The Battle of Castle Itter is not a myth. It is a fact. The records are there. The French prisoners wrote about it. The American soldiers gave interviews. The German survivors told their stories. It was the only time during the Second World War that American and German soldiers fought together as allies. And it happened because one German officer decided that saving lives was more important than following orders. Conclusion. If you believe that this kind of story deserves to be remembered, a story that proves that even in the worst of times, humanity can break through the hatred, then hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. And I want to know what you think. What would you have done in Gangl's place? Leave a comment below. I read them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're telling the stories that history forgot. The strange ones, the complex ones, the ones that don't fit neatly into a textbook. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Sometimes he is something much stranger, a brother in arms, for one day only.